In 1914, there stood a small remote island with no cities or crowds, just a lighthouse and a secret hidden in the ocean depths. Our story begins with a ship traveling through the South Atlantic Ocean. On board was David, a weather officer. The government had sent him to this isolated island to observe its changing weather patterns. He was to stay for about a year, collect data, understand the unusual climate shifts, and then return. After a long journey, they finally reached the island. The captain and David unloaded essential supplies and equipment. On the island stood a lighthouse and a small house where David would stay, as it had previously been occupied by another weather officer. But when they entered the house, they were shocked. There was no sign of any person. The furniture was scattered and everything was in disarray. Thinking someone might be in the lighthouse, they headed there only to find it surrounded by sharp wooden stakes, as if someone had deliberately blocked the entrance. After knocking several times with no response, they forced their way in. At the very top, they found a man named Gruner lying down. When asked about the previous officer, he replied coldly, "He died, some terrible disease." When the captain asked about the body, Gruner's answer was even more disturbing. Someone probably killed him. The captain told David he could still return with them, but David knew that accurate weather reports from this island could earn him significant money, which he desperately needed. So he decided to stay. The captain gave him a gun for protection, sensing the place wasn't as safe as it appeared. After the captain left, David settled into the house. In a drawer, he found a diary belonging to the previous officer who had arrived on the island in 1913. The diary contained many notes about the island, though some entries were incomplete. It also featured sketches of strange creatures. David couldn't understand why he'd drawn them, perhaps just to pass time in his loneliness. There was also a photo of the officer's wife. The next morning, David began his work. Near the ocean, he noticed stones arranged in strange patterns with seashells placed among them. He thought Gruner might have done this and returned to his job of collecting weather data. While working, he spotted what looked like another person with Gruner through his binoculars, but dismissed it as his imagination. That night, as David worked, there was a knock at the door. Thinking it was Gruner, he called out but received no answer. Lamp in hand, he approached the door and heard strange sounds. Then he saw an inhuman hand trying to reach under the door. Terrified, David fled to the basement and hid. The mysterious creature entered the house searching for him. Through a small crack in the basement, its frightening eyes stared at David. He grabbed a knife and, when the eyes appeared at the crack again, stabbed with all his strength. The creature shrieked and fled, but it could return any time. David secured the basement door tightly and spent the night awake, gripped by fear. The next morning, David found strange footprints in the sand, clearly not human. They led straight to the ocean. Now he understood why Gruner had surrounded the lighthouse with sharp stakes, protection from these creatures. His house wasn't safe at all. Terrified, David ran to the lighthouse, shouting for Gruner to let him in. But Gruner refused, saying, "You should have left with that ship." Returning to his house, David began fortifying it. He boarded up every window, created a barrier of sharp stakes, and placed old papers and books outside the gate, dousing them with oil. If the creature returned, he could scare it away with fire. Luckily, he found an old box containing a gun and plenty of bullets, which gave him some courage despite his lingering fear. As darkness fell, David sat quietly in a corner, gun in hand, breathing heavily. Then he heard a strange sound. When he approached the window, what he saw made his blood run cold. Not one, but many creatures emerging from the water, all heading toward his house. Soon they began trying to break through the gate. David opened fire, dropping some creatures but making the others more aggressive. As their numbers grew, he lit the papers and books outside. Seeing the fire, the creatures retreated back to the sea. But now the fire had reached David's house. Since it was made entirely of wood, the flames spread rapidly. Wrapping himself in a sheet, David escaped through the gate and hid behind a large rock near the lighthouse. His right hand was badly burned. Fortunately, it started raining, gradually extinguishing the fire. But by morning, his house was almost completely burned down. To survive, David needed shelter in the lighthouse. He took his rifle and hid among the rocks nearby. When Gruner came out to fetch water, David followed him, planning to force his way in at gunpoint. But suddenly Gruner pointed a gun at him and a strange creature near Gruner attacked. Gruner quickly stopped it, saying, "This is my pet. David didn't shoot but offered a deal. If he wanted to survive, Gruner had to let him stay in the lighthouse. He had enough gunpowder for a year and enough food for both of them. Gruner reluctantly agreed, and before nightfall, they returned to the lighthouse with the remaining food. The next morning, the creature was quietly licking David's hand as he slept, and surprisingly, his hand began to heal significantly. At the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner counting bullets with the creature helping in its own way. This meant the animal wasn't violent by nature. David wanted to learn more about this creature and eventually reveal its existence to the world. It seemed nothing short of miraculous, a female creature from the deep ocean depths. But Gruner didn't want this. He had no family and believed that in society, everyone must be someone's slave or servant. For him, this island was perfect, a place where he considered himself king. That's why he had written Gruner is king in many parts of the island. But how had this female creature become his pet? Gruner had once saved her life when she was small, caught in his fishing net. Since then, she had stayed with him, obeying his every command. However, Gruner was an angry man who never treated her humanely. He had regular physical relations with her, and once, when she attacked him, he punished her so severely that she began to see herself as his servant. Perhaps this was why those creatures emerged from the sea each night, trying to take her back. David no longer wanted to stay. He hoped to signal a passing ship and leave this place. But Gruner claimed no ships ever came to the island. David felt trapped and suffocated, desperate to escape. As evening fell, Gruner told him to ready his gun, as the creatures might attack at any time. They prepared to turn on the lighthouse light, and soon a large number of creatures emerged from the sea, advancing toward the lighthouse. Gruner fired at them continuously, but David was paralyzed with fear. Despite Gruner's repeated calls, he just sat quietly in a corner and eventually passed out. Gruner fought the creatures alone. The next morning, Gruner angrily woke David and laid down the rules. If he wanted to stay in the lighthouse, he must follow every command, fetch water daily, do all the chores, and stand guard duty at night. Whether David liked it or not, this became necessary for survival. David was willing to do all of Gruner's work. But there was one thing he couldn't stand, watching him physically torture the female creature in different ways each day. But David also thought that perhaps Gruner's mind was no longer sound after years of isolation on this deserted island. Night fell again. Both prepared for guard duty, and once more the creatures emerged from the sea. But this time David wasn't afraid. He fired, but Gruner did nothing. He left David outside, locking the lighthouse gate behind him, wanting David to learn how to fight these creatures on his own. David screamed for help, but Gruner ignored him. After fighting through the night, morning arrived. Gruner found David sitting outside the lighthouse gate, covered in blood. He had learned to fight these creatures, and his fear was gone. Time passed this way, fighting the creatures at night and handling Gruner's lighthouse chores during the day. The island had become like a prison for David. He constantly thought about escaping, about freedom. Over time, David formed a strange friendship with the female creature. He named her Anarias and felt sorry for her. He now understood how difficult it was to live alone, away from one's own people. Perhaps she felt the same way. One day, they noticed the attacks were gradually decreasing. David thought perhaps the creatures migrated elsewhere during winter, like whales, or maybe they'd realized fighting was pointless. But Gruner firmly disagreed. Not at all. They'll attack again. They're reproducing now. Their numbers are growing. A few more days passed. One night after dinner, Gruner and David started playing chess to pass time. But they became so engrossed in the game that they forgot to turn on the lighthouse lights. Taking advantage of the darkness, the creatures attacked. David saw they had indeed reproduced. There were now so many that two men couldn't fight them for long. Their bullets were almost exhausted. Somehow they managed to reach the top of the lighthouse, but Gruner was badly injured. The creatures were trying to enter the lighthouse, and David and Gruner saw no escape. They had given up hope when, fortunately, morning arrived. As the sun slowly rose, the creatures abandoned the lighthouse and returned to the sea. Anarias tried to heal Gruner's wounds, but by now, David understood they couldn't win this fight against the creatures. The bullets were nearly gone, and they didn't have enough food to last much longer. The next day, David spotted a ship in the ocean. He quickly grabbed a flare gun to signal it, but Gruner stopped him. He didn't want David to leave. At that moment, Anarias attacked Gruner, trying to save David. Gruner didn't want anyone to leave this island. It was his own world, where he lived like a king with a servant who obeyed his every command. After being alone for so long, he now had someone to talk to, and he wasn't about to let David go. Slowly, the ship disappeared from David's sight. There was nothing he could do now. More days passed. Gruner continued to mistreat both David and Ananias, particularly beating her, which David hated. One day, David gave Ananias a small toy boat he'd made from whale bones, hoping to cheer her up. When Ananias saw the boat, she led David to a corner of the island where a real boat was hidden. When David asked Gruner about it, he admitted he already knew about the boat. A few months earlier, an arms smuggling ship carrying ammunition had sunk near the island during a storm. Some people had reached the island alive by boat, but none survived until morning. All fell victim to the creatures. Hearing this, David had an idea. They had something like a diving suit. If one of them dove to that part of the sea, they might find bullets or dynamite to help fight the monsters. Gruner flatly refused, not wanting to go near the ocean, but David was willing to risk his life. More days passed, and David and Ananias developed a deep connection. David had grown to like her. Gruner secretly observed this and, for the first time, considered helping David. But his real intention was to have David bring back the dynamite boxes from underwater, then abandon him in the sea for the creatures to kill. This way, he would get the dynamite and Ananias would remain his slave. They reached the spot. David put on the diving suit and descended. The ship was completely destroyed, but fortunately, they found some boxes of dynamite. Suddenly, the creatures appeared. David panicked and fell. The iron diving suit was so heavy he couldn't move or signal Gruner, who thought the creatures had killed him. But there were only two small creature children. David created pressure underwater, abandoned his diving suit, and swam to the surface himself. They found some old boxes containing dynamite and laid them in two layers around the lighthouse, planning to eliminate the monsters in one strike during the next attack. A few months passed and snow began to fall, but once again the creatures disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Their main job now was to operate the lighthouse and maintain their watch as usual. Gruner's patience was breaking. Perhaps Anarias had told the monsters about the dynamite plan, which was why they no longer attacked. Furious, Gruner started beating Anarias, but David stopped him. Finally, they devised a new plan, leaving the lighthouse's main gate open so that as soon as the creatures approached, they could be blown up with dynamite. Soon, the creatures emerged from the sea, moved straight toward the main gate, and attacked David as they entered. David bravely confronted them. As the creatures reached the lighthouse, Gruner pressed the dynamite lever, but there was no explosion. David had disconnected it and forgotten to reconnect it. David rushed upstairs to connect the wire while the creatures tried to climb the lighthouse, with only Gruner trying to stop them, alone. As soon as the connection was complete, David detonated the first layer. Many creatures were killed in the blast, but many more were still ready to attack the lighthouse. So Gruner detonated the second layer as well. Both men lost consciousness in the massive explosion. The next morning, when they regained consciousness, Anarias was gone. Dead creatures lay scattered everywhere. Gruner was killing those who were still alive but wounded. Then David noticed a necklace around one creature's neck, and in that moment he realized his biggest mistake. The creatures they had believed to be violent were civilized like humans. They just couldn't speak. Perhaps their attacks on the lighthouse had been for a reason. But for Gruner, these were pointless concerns. He considered himself the king of this island, and everyone had to obey his command. After that day, the creatures never attacked like before. But every day, a crying sound came from the seashore. David still didn't understand how much damage they had caused, how many families had been broken, how many children had lost their people, all because of a misunderstanding. The next day, David saw some small creature children in the sea, all orphaned. He arranged stones in a circle and placed the small toy boat in the center, hoping Anarias would return. But no matter how long he waited, she never came back. One morning, David found Gruner unconscious, surrounded by old items. Among them was a picture, the same one David had seen in Gruner's diary on his first day. It was his wife. Gruner's real name was Robert, and he was the weather officer who had come to this island about a year ago. He had changed his name because he never wanted to leave this island. Seeing this, David also gave up hope of ever leaving. The next evening, when David went to the seashore, he saw that the small boat was no longer in the circle. Instead, there was a small creature child holding the boat. David threw his torch into the center of the circle to show he had no intention of fighting. He wanted to be friends. Shortly after, Anarius emerged from the waves, followed by an entire group of creatures rising from the sea. But this time, none attacked David because they also wanted peace. Their intention had only been to find a safe place for their children, something every animal does. They hadn't liked the sudden human presence on their island, which was why they attacked each night. But who could explain this to Gruner? He still considered himself the island's king. He came out of the lighthouse carrying a gun. David tried to explain that these creatures didn't want to fight, they wanted peace. But Gruner wouldn't listen. He shouted at Anarias to go inside. But for the first time, she disobeyed him. She was no longer his servant. She was now just a mother standing up for her children. Gruner began to feel weak inside because no one was following his orders anymore. Angrily, he started walking toward the lighthouse. David thought perhaps Gruner had finally understood that every creature wants freedom. No one wants to live as someone else's slave. But Gruner wasn't a wise man. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare that directly hit a small creature child, killing it instantly. All the creatures fled in fear, and Anarias lost all her trust in David. Enraged, David ran to the lighthouse and confronted Gruner. Why did you do this? They just wanted peace. But Gruner had become so violent that he decided to kill David. As he was about to strike David with an axe, David called him by his real name, Robert. Hearing this, Gruner froze. In truth, Robert had never been such a person. After coming to this island, his mental state had almost completely broken down. Loneliness, his wife's death, and deep depression had transformed him. He wasn't actually a killer, he had been a good person. The creatures never wanted to fight, they just wanted peace. Gruner had killed them only to make himself feel powerful. And now he realized his mistake. He surrendered himself to the creatures who killed him in moments. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time passed, and a year later, a government officer arrived on the island with a new weather officer. David was taken away, and the new government officers began monitoring the weather on the island. But the officer thought David was Gruner, and David didn't correct this misunderstanding. He quietly went to the balcony and stood there without saying anything, because now, just like Gruner, he no longer wanted to leave this island. Meanwhile, Anarias lived happily with her family. They no longer feared someone like Gruner. Now they could live freely both on the island and in the sea.